Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're looking at something kind of interesting. It's this idea that powerful nations have a habit of kind of breaking treaties when it's, convenient for them.
Yeah, that's definitely a theme we see throughout history.
It is. And what's funny is we're doing this deep dive because of Professor Jorge Machfood.
Oh, right.
You know him, right?
Yeah.
He responded to this thing with President Trump proposing that we reclaim the Panama Canal,
Oh, wow.
and I thought, that's interesting. And I started looking at Machfood's work, and he argues that this whole breaking treaties thing, it's not just a one-off. It's like a pattern
Yeah.
throughout history.
He really digs deep into that concept.
Yeah, and he's saying that it goes back centuries and spans all these different continents and has impacted so many different cultures.
Definitely.
It's a pretty bold claim, though, don't you think? I mean, are we really talking about like a consistent pattern here or just a few, isolated incidents?
Well, that's the thing. Mashfood has tons of historical examples to back up his argument. Yeah, to really get what he's saying, we should probably start by looking at some of the treaties involving indigenous peoples in North America.
Okay, that sounds like a good place to start.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of history there, obviously. A lot of complex relationships and agreements. Where does Matchfoot even begin with all of that?
He actually points to the Royal Proclamation of 1763 as a prime example.
Oh, okay.
This was issued by the British Empire, and it promised indigenous nations land west of a specific boundary line.
I think I know what's coming next. As soon as those settlers started pushing westward, all those promises went out the window, right?
Exactly. That desire for land and resources, it always seemed to trump those treaty agreements.
Yeah.
And that led to conflict displacement and, the gradual erosion of indigenous sovereignty.
And this wasn't just a one-time thing, was it?
No, not at all. We see this pattern repeating over and over again.
Like what else?
Take the Louisiana Purchase, for example.
Oh, yeah.
Indigenous peoples were completely left out of those negotiations, even though the treaty directly impacted their land rights.
It's like the classic case of out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
Right? If they weren't at the negotiating table, their interests were just ignored.
Yeah, pretty much. And this disregard for indigenous land rights, it gets even worse with the Indian Removal Act of 1830.
Yeah.
This act led to the forced displacement of the Cherokee Nation.
Wow.
And get this happened despite existing treaties and even Supreme Court rulings upholding their right to remain on their land.
I'm familiar with the Trail of Tears, of course, but to think that it happened even though they had legal protections, it's mind-boggling. So Mashfood's saying that this wasn't just an oversight, right? This disregard for treaties with indigenous peoples. He's saying it was a deliberate pattern.
Exactly. He sees it as a symptom of a larger trend where powerful nations prioritize their own interests, even when it means breaking their word and violating the rights of others.
So we're seeing how this played out with indigenous populations. But does Mashfood see this pattern extending beyond interactions with Native Americans?
Absolutely. He points to the Texas annexation and the Mexican-American War as another clear example.
Can you set the stage for us? What was happening in Texas at that time?
Well, initially, American settlers were welcomed into Mexican Texas.
Oh.
However, over time, tensions grew, and eventually those settlers revolted.
Really?
Yeah, leading to the Texas Revolution and the subsequent annexation of Texas by the United States.
So American settlers went from being welcomed guests to basically staging a takeover.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. And this annexation directly violated treaties and territorial agreements with Mexico. And that ultimately triggered the Mexican-American War.
It's fascinating how Mashfood highlights the irony of those American settlers becoming like illegal immigrants in Mexican Texas.
Right.
Before ultimately breaking their oath of allegiance to Mexico.
Yeah, he uses that point to emphasize how quickly loyalties and agreements can shift when it's convenient for the more powerful party.
Yeah, and of course there's the whole issue of how this conflict was justified, right? Like manifest destiny, expanding freedom westward. These were powerful narratives at the time.
Exactly. But Mashfood argues that these grand narratives often masked underlying economic and political motives.
Like what?
The desire for land resources and expanding power, they played a significant role.
So it's about looking beyond the surface justifications and understanding the deeper forces at play.
Precisely. And this pattern isn't limited to North America. Mashfood takes us across the Pacific to examine U.S. interactions with Japan, specifically Commodore Perry's arrival in Tokyo Bay.
Oh yeah, Commodore Perry. I remember learning about him in school. He wasn't exactly there for a casual visit, was he?
Not quite. He arrived with a fleet of warships, a show of force intended to pressure Japan into opening its ports to American trade.
Right, because Japan had that long-standing policy of isolationism.
Exactly. And Perry was there to change that, whether they like it or not.
So we're talking about gunboat diplomacy, using military might to force a nation's hand.
Exactly. Perry's arrival was a clear demonstration of the power imbalance between the two nations.
Yeah.
Japan, faced with the threat of military action, was essentially forced to sign treaties granting trading rights to the United States.
Is this another example of those grand narratives masking a more self-serving agenda?
Majford would argue yes. While the U.S. promoted this as opening Japan to the benefits of trade, it was also about securing access to new markets and resources for American businesses.
It sounds like a recurring theme here. Powerful nations using their might to dictate terms, even if it means breaking existing agreements or coercing weaker nations into unfavorable treaties.
That's a key takeaway from Majford's work. He sees this pattern repeating itself throughout history, often with devastating consequences. And he argues that this tendency to prioritize self-interest over treaty obligations isn't just a relic of the past.
You're saying this pattern continues into more recent times?
Yes, in fact, we can see it play out in a story much closer at home, the story of the Sioux Nation and the Garrison Dam.
Okay, this is getting really interesting. I'm ready to dive deeper into this.
Yeah, so the story of the Sioux Nation and the Garrison Dam, it's a really powerful example of how these patterns of broken treaties, they keep happening even in more recent history.
Okay, I'm all ears. Fill me in on what happened.
So in the 1940s, the U.S. government decided to build this dam in North Dakota, the Garrison Dam.
Okay.
And the problem was this project, it would require flooding a big chunk of the Sioux Nation's reservation land.
Hold on, flooding the reservation land. Didn't the Sioux Nation have treaties that, protected their territory?
They did, but the government, they were really eager to get this dam project going.
Yeah.
So they put a ton of pressure on the Sioux Nation to sell the land.
So even though they had legal protections, the Sioux Nation was basically forced into giving up their land. How is that even possible?
Well, the government used a bunch of tactics, legal maneuvering, political pressure, and they offered financial compensation. And they kept saying that the dam was essential for flood control and economic development. They made it sound like a matter of national interest.
It sounds like they were put in an impossible position. How could they stand up to that kind of pressure from the federal government?
They did try to resist.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the tribal leaders, they argued that the flooding would destroy sacred sites, disrupt their way of life, and, sever their connection to their ancestral lands.
Right.
But in the end, they were facing overwhelming pressure and they had limited resources.
Yeah.
So they were forced to agree to the sale.
This is just heartbreaking. What were the consequences for the Sioux Nation?
They were devastating. The flooding displaced hundreds of families, destroyed valuable farmland, and submerged those sacred sites we were talking about.
Oh, wow.
It disrupted their traditional economy and forced many to relocate and try to find new livelihoods.
It's a tragic reminder that these broken treaties, they're not just abstract historical events.
Right.
They have real tangible consequences for people's lives and cultures.
Exactly. And the Garrison Dam story, it shows how these patterns can persist even when there's greater awareness of the injustices faced by indigenous peoples.
So we've seen how broken treaties have impacted indigenous populations in North America. But Professor Maishwood argues that this pattern extends to other parts of the world too.
Right, absolutely. He points to the Spanish-American War as another prime example.
Okay.
So after the war, the United States gained control of Puerto Rico, Cuba, Guam, and the Philippines.
Wow, that's a huge shift in global power dynamics. How do those territorial acquisitions fit into Professor Matchwood's argument about broken treaties?
Well, he argues that these territories were basically ceded to the U.S. without the consent of the people who lived there.
Oh.
They had no say in their fate. They were simply transferred from one colonial power to another.
So even though the Spanish-American War was fought under the banner of, liberating Cuba from Spanish rule,
right,
it ended up being more about the U.S. asserting its own dominance.
That's a key part of Matchwood's argument. He suggests that the rhetoric of liberation often masked a more self-serving agenda, a desire to expand American power and influence.
It's amazing how these patterns seem to repeat themselves across different time periods and geographic regions. It's like a playbook that keeps getting reused.
That's a really good observation. And it shows how important it is to understand these historical patterns so that we can recognize them when they emerge in current events.
So far, we've mostly focused on examples of territorial disputes and broken promises regarding land rights. Does Professor Mashwood's work look at any other types of treaty violations?
It does. He also examines how treaties have been used to impose economic policies on other nations, often to the detriment of those nations' own interests.
This sounds like a whole other layer of complexity. Can you give us an example of how this played out?
Let's go back to Commodore Perry's expedition to Japan.
Okay.
Remember, Perry arrived with a fleet of warships, essentially forcing Japan to open its ports to American trade.
Right, gunboat diplomacy in action.
Exactly. And while this is often framed as a story of Japan's opening to the world, Majfood says it's really important to understand the power dynamics at play. Japan was essentially coerced into signing these treaties.
So it wasn't exactly a free and fair negotiation between equals.
Not at all. And the consequences for Japan were significant. These forced trade agreements disrupted traditional Japanese industries, led to economic exploitation, and ultimately contributed to social and political upheaval.
It's fascinating how he connects these seemingly disparate historical events, from broken treaties with indigenous peoples to forced trade agreements in Japan. And he reveals this larger pattern of powerful nations acting in their own self-interest, even if it means breaking their word.
That's the power of his analysis. He encourages us to look beyond the surface narratives and recognize the underlying power dynamics that have shaped history.
It definitely makes you think twice about those grand narratives we often hear about progress and expansion.
It's about understanding history from multiple perspectives and questioning those narratives that often justify the actions of the powerful.
This is giving me a lot to think about. I'm curious to hear more about the long-term consequences of these broken treaties. I mean, beyond the immediate harm to the affected communities, what kind of impact do these violations have on the broader international system?
That's a really important question, and one that Professor Majfood addresses in his work. He argues that breaking treaties, it has a corrosive effect on international relations. It erodes trust and undermines the foundation of a rules-based world order.
Okay, let's dive into that a bit more. I'm ready to explore the ripple effects of these broken treaties. So we've been talking about Professor Madfood's argument, that powerful nations throughout history have broken treaties when they no longer serve their interests. And it's kind of a sobering look at how power dynamics have shaped international relations.
Yeah, and what's really concerning is the long-term impact of these broken treaties. It's not just about the immediate consequences for the communities involved. It also erodes trust within the entire international system.
So it's not just about one broken promise, it's about the ripple effects that can undermine cooperation on a global scale.
Exactly. When a powerful nation breaks a treaty, it sends a message that agreements are basically meaningless. The power trumps principle.
That sounds like a recipe for chaos and instability.
It can be. When trust is broken, it's way harder for nations to work together to address these common challenges.
Like what?
Think about climate change pandemics or like global economic crises.
Yeah.
Those require international cooperation, and cooperation relies on trust.
So these broken treaties, even those from centuries ago, they're still impacting our ability to address the pressing issues of today.
Absolutely. The legacy of these broken promises continues to shape how nations interact with each other. It creates suspicion and undermines those international institutions.
That's a pretty bleak outlook. Is there any hope for creating a more just and equitable international system? One where treaties are actually upheld and respected?
I wouldn't say it's hopeless, but it requires a shift in mindset. A recognition that a stable and prosperous world requires cooperation based on mutual respect and a commitment to upholding agreements.
That sounds great in theory, but how do we actually make that happen?
Professor Marchford argues that it starts with awareness. We need to understand these historical patterns, recognize the power dynamics, and hold those powerful nations accountable for their actions.
So it's about shining a light on these injustices, making sure they don't get swept under the rug or justified by those grand narratives we've been talking about.
Exactly. It's about pushing for more transparency in international relations, demanding that treaties be upheld, and supporting institutions that promote a rules-based international order.
It sounds like it requires a collective effort, not just from governments, but from civil society, international organizations, even individuals.
Absolutely. We all have a role to play in shaping a more just and equitable world.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with one question. If this pattern of broken treaties has been going on for centuries, how can we as a global community break free from this cycle and create a future where agreements are honored and trust is the foundation of international relations?
That's the challenge before us. It requires a commitment to learning from the past, holding power accountable, and working together to build a more just and sustainable future. It's a long and complex journey, but one worth taking.
Well said.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some things to think about and inspired you to keep exploring these complex issues.